So now we're recording. It should show us as recording now. Great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start because I'm going to assume everybody is on. And so I will go ahead and start. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ivy Ashton. I'm the founder of the Legal Server. And the purpose of today's call is to go over a specific functionality that we have called Advanced Grants Management, and kind of walk through the different pieces of it. It's a web of different things, so there's a lot of aspects to it. And I'll do my best to kind of systematically go through how all of these different pieces are interconnected. So let me start by just saying that the very baseline purpose that we were trying to, the problem we were trying to solve when we created Advanced Grants Management is to basically to take timekeeping data for employees, and based on that timekeeping data, spend down specific grants based on the hourly rates of the employees, and I'll talk about that for a minute, or in a minute. And at the end of it, the paycheck of the employee would be auditable against Legal Server. In other words, if my paycheck said, for this pay period, I made $2,000, those $2,000 should be found somewhere in Legal Server, so that I could prove that the hours I worked were spent down on the grants. So I want to start with that because some people actually spend down their grants differently and don't like that idea, but that was the idea we were trying to solve when we created Advanced Grants Management. We have some offshoots, some possibilities that can take that piece away, so that you couldn't audit your paycheck against Legal Server, that you would spend it down in a different way. So there are some ways to handle that, but the overall purpose of it was to be able to spend down that. So unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, but I just want to make sure that makes sense to everybody before we start. So that's the baseline premise that we're going to be up against. And I'm just going to assume that the answer, that makes sense to everybody and kind of keep going. So let's start with just the Grants Management tab. So in Legal Server, if you have Grants Management, you'll have a tab that shows up at the top of the screen. That tab will list all of your grants and show the available funds and things like that. So you're looking at a demo site here of that has Advanced Grants Management enabled, and it's showing all the various grants. So this is kind of ground zero. So we'll start with the concept of the grant, and then we'll work through the various concepts. So the first concept is that at the hub of the wheel, you're going to have a grant. A grant is going to have a bunch of information about it. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about the grant, and then we'll move on. But the idea here with the grants is that an example of a grant would be VAWA, right? If you get the VAWA funding, you get a contract term every year, you get a contract every year, but the hub of it is VAWA, right? So this is the hub. We'll talk about the contracts in a second. So there's just basic information. I won't go through everything, but basically you would put all your grants in here, including the ones you're applying for, and you would also have your old grants that have expired and that you're no longer going after would remain in here, although you can make them inactive so you don't see them. So you're going to have various information that is stored about the grant. And I'm not going to go through every piece of it, but one of the key pieces to this is whether or not the grant, for the purposes of Legal Server, is restricted or unrestricted. Now, this is I apologize about this every single day I talk about Advanced Grants Management. This is the worst term we could have named this field, but I want to explain to you what it means. LSC, for instance, would be considered an unrestricted grant for the purposes of grants management. It has nothing to do with whether or not there are restrictions on the grant. It just means whether or not it's a general pool of money. Typically with LSC, you don't send LSC a bill for every hour you work. You just get an amount of money and then you report all the cases that you worked on. So it's unrestricted in that sense. VAWA would be a restricted grant in this sense. Typically in a VAWA grant, you're going to invoice DOJ for the work you do, and you're going to get paid an amount of money for every hour that you work. So we want to spend down those grants first. So that's an important concept we'll come back to later, but that concept of being restricted and unrestricted for the purposes of this is an important one. And again, I'm just going to highlight a couple other features here. Within grants, you can track things like notes, right? So think of a grant profile just like you would a case profile. I want to put all the times I spoke to the funder or did something on this grant. I can track my notes here so that the next time somebody comes in after I leave and they want to see what has been done on this grant, they'll see my notes. Documents, just like on a case, you can track documents. So here I'd put the RFP, I'd put the report that we sent to the funder, I'd put the signed contract, I'd put all the various things that we might want to store on a grant. Why is this important? It's important because, again, once somebody leaves, the person that comes in behind them will have all of the former paperwork and all of that. That's probably saved in some shared drive now or whatever. If you associate it with the grant, it'll be with the grant in the profile. You can assign various people in the organization. This is different than the people who bill against it. This is assignments. It's really meant for who is the grant accountant, who's primarily responsible. That's just a way of you tracking. So some agencies, the agency we initially built this for had, I think, upwards of 275 active grants, and they had various people managing each of the grants. And so they just wanted to know who's in charge of this grant, who's the accountant, who's the primary person, who's the managing attorney, all of that kind of stuff. Those are what assignments are. Contacts, this is just like a Rolodex. This would be people at the funder. You might put the person you call when you have an issue with a check, or the person you call to, apply for new funding or whatever. This is just, think about it like as a Rolodex. The reports feature is actually one of my favorite features. It's a very subtle feature, but basically the reports feature allows you to create in reports in the tab called reports on Legal Server, and then indicate which reports you run for this grant. So I'll use LSC as an example, right? If you're LSC funded, you're probably going to run several reports in Legal Server to get all of the data out of the system that you need to report to LSC. So you would put each of those grants that you create to run the different, this report is for section M1 of that grant. And then you set up the filters and you set up all the things that you would typically set up on the, to run to get the information out of Legal Server for that part of the grant. You put in a note that says, I filter on this information, use it for this section of the report or whatever. Once you have that in here, then this is where you go every time, right? So if you're going to run the reports for LSC, you come to the LSC profile, you look at the reports tab, you see all the reports that you typically run, and then you run them from here. Clicking on these reports will just open the report that it references, and then over here you see the notes that you can put in. You can put tasks and deadlines, just like you can on cases. So again, think of this as very parallel to how a case handler handles a case. We've got an RFP due on this date. We've got a contract that we have to have signed and submitted by this date. We can expect funding by this date, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's kind of some of the core information that we store in grants. A second aspect to grants management that's an important one is the concept of funding filters. So funding filters, actually, let me back up a second. Grants get stored on various objects in the database. So for instance, and this may be a shift, I can never remember how KEMPS does this. So it may be exactly the same or it may be a shift. But in Legal Server, you can store a funding code on the case and a funding codes on each time slip. So I could have a case that is tied to funding code A and a time slip for that case that ultimately is tied to funding code B. Does someone have a question on that?
I just wanted to make a comment on that, Ivy, is I've been in some discussions with Jeff on that issue.
Yep.
Because in Pennsylvania, for purposes of cost allocations, the funding sources on case time entries must always be the same as the funding sources on the respective cases.
Okay.
So we've been in discussions about defaulting the funding source on a time entry when it's first created. And we're talking through some possible methodologies of making sure that if a case is reassigned to a different funding source, there can be some kind of a process in Legal Server that will also change associated funding sources on respective time entries for that case. That's the conference call you and Jeff and I have scheduled in August to discuss that further. So
Okay.
I just wanted to mention that so people know that we are having conversations about that issue.
Yep. Thank you. Good to know. Even with that functionality, it's still important to know that they're at least stored, even if they end up being funding code A on both the case and the time slip. They are stored separately. That's an important piece of grants management. The other things you can store, just to make it simple, I'll just say the other thing you can store time on or a funding code on is an outreach. So those things can be activated to turn on so that you can store grants. So as a starting point, when you put in a funding code, you are going to indicate whether or not to show this funding code up here. See where it says show funding code for cases? Yes. Show grant for service. That's basically a time slip. And then, show funding code for timekeeping and show funding code for outreaches down below. So you can see where all of those are turned on. So those are the places in the database that we store funding codes. And that's an important piece. Now, the other piece of this is you can set up what are called advanced filters. So if you come up here and click on edit advanced filters, this is what allows you to create. You say, okay, I want to filter on something that is tied to the case. So this one up here, you can see it's tied to the case as age. So the case has to, the person on the case has to be between 60 and 100 in order for this funding code to work. So if the person is 55 years old, this funding code will not show up on their on the end user screen. You can't choose it because it's not going to be available. Now, what we typically hear right after go live is, hey, that funding code isn't available. What's going on? You must not have migrated it or something. And then we say, nope, a filter has been set up that says you have to be over 60 and this client's 47. Oh, right, okay. And this tool was built purposely to avoid the situation in December or whenever you do your grant reporting to go in and have to find all of the exceptions and fix the cases that were tied to the wrong funding codes and things like that. So you can tie it to anything basically tied to a case. So in this one, it's showing that you also have to be a veteran. So to set one up, you just come here, you select the filter you want to use. So, I'll put county of dispute, say, right? So I could just choose that. And that within that, I could choose whatever the values that I wanted, could have more than one value. And it would choose that. If I wanted to look instead at a time slip, so this would be things like, okay, we can't, we can put time in on this case, but the funder won't pay for in-court time. So I could come here and put in, court and say in court, the value has to be no. And what that translates to is that if somebody tries to put a time slip in that is where in court is yes, this funding code it'll tell the end user, you're not allowed to charge your time to this funding code because the funder won't pay for time in court, is this example. All right, so that's basically advanced filters. Any questions so far? Okay, so I'm assuming that's no, but just again, unmute yourself and ask the question if you have it. So I'm going to look at, now we're going to talk about contract terms. So this is where kind of the rubber hits the road. Contract terms, if you think about the grant as the hub, contract terms are the spokes. So we would have a contract term for 2015 VAWA, we'd have a contract term for 2016 VAWA, and then one for 2017 VAWA. Now the difference between each of the contract terms is the amount of money that we get and where we are on that term. So kind of the key pieces of information that you need to know about contract terms are, you always need to know when the start date is, when the end date is, and ultimately what the total salary budgeted amount is. Those are the three pieces of information that you always need to have in order for contract terms to work. So what happens when you enter a time slip is that we look at the date of the service and figure out what contract terms are effective on that date. So if the contract term ends on June 30th and you're putting a time slip in on July 1st, this contract term will no longer be affected and it will no longer be spent down unless you expand the contract term end date beyond June 30th. So the end date controls and the start date controls what time is going to get charged to this time slip. So contract terms are managed similarly to everything else. You've got a profile, you can put in various pieces of information about, when this, as I said, the start date, the end date, the amount you want to spend down. You can also track if you're doing, has the contract been signed? Has the RFP been issued? Have we completed the RFP? Like all the kind of mechanics of every contract that happens. So at some point you have to apply for renewed funding. When you apply for renewed funding, you would start a new contract term, indicate that the status of this contract term is we're applying for funding and the RFP due date is X date. We responded on this date. The contract has been signed on this date, those types of things. And then once it becomes effective, we got an award. That award was for this amount of money. We're going to spend down this amount of money. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. That's the problem with muting everybody is there's no feedback loop here to make sure that what I'm saying is resonating. But so here's where we get a lot of questions on this. So let's say that we get $1 million grant, and we're going to spend it down by the hour for every employee that works on that. So one of the things that we typically get is what happens if we're going to take some amount of money off the top to pay for our rent and to buy computers and whatever, and we do that. That's very normal. Almost everyone does that on every contract. So you would have an award amount of $1 million. You would have a spend down amount of $800,000, let's say, right? So in that scenario, you've taken $200,000, you're going to spend it however. We don't track that in Legal Server. We're not tracking every stapler you buy or, whatever. That's handled by your accounting system. We don't care about that. We just know that you took $200,000 off the top and that really what we're spending down is $800,000. So the first time somebody puts a time slip in, we're going to look at their rate. We're going to multiply it times the amount of time they worked, and we're going to subtract that from the $800,000. So that's how it gets spent down. So everyone has different rates. Everyone gets paid differently, different amounts. The system will spend down the grant based on who's doing the work and what their rate is on that day. So in this example, we've got an allocation amount that was $158,000 $72.64. What does that mean? It means that we were allocated that amount of money for this grant, for this contract term. That's ultimately the amount we're spending down. Of that money, we have $15,878.89 left to spend. Okay, so we're going to come back to this too, because sorry, knocked my headset off. We're going to come back to this too, because this is an important piece as well, because this shows you where you're at, right? And it's going to be relative to the end of the contract to determine how much you should be spending down each pay period. And as I said, we'll come back to that. The other aspect to contract terms that's important is the concept of goals. So allocations work that we're spending down the money. Goals are things that you set up. And so here's a nuance that a lot of agencies will recognize in this as well, which is that they'll say to a funder, we will give you one FTE, basically one employee for the year. But they won't name the employee sometimes. They'll say, we're going to give you the equivalent. So I don't know what that equates to, although I should in Pennsylvania. In New York, it equates to 1,820 hours. So you have kind of two tracks, at least in New York, right? You've got the track that's looking at hours requirement. We got to hit 1,820 hours, and you've got the amount of money that you have to spend down, say $100,000. Those two are going to be almost by definition different, right? Because every hour you work isn't spending down the $100,000 the same. So you might hit your 1,820 hours early, or you might hit your dollar amount early, but either way, you've got to be able to show both. So here you can set up goals for the amount of time. You can also set up goals for the number of cases. And so this is showing you where you are to your goal. So this one has a goal of setting up 6,000 hours of work. And it has so far 3,891 hours locked in. So we're at 64.86% of where we're supposed to be on that. Some of these will be, so this is outreaches. We said we do 25, we've done one. The value, so we're 18% of the value. We're cases open. We said we'd open 2667. We've only opened 155, so we're at 5.81% of our goal. So anyway, as you roll down, and the way you deal with this is you come over and you say, I want to edit my allocation goals. And within each, you're basically come here to set up the various ones. So you can see here where it says track cases opened during the contract term. So this is looking at the date in which a case was open and the start date and the end date of the contract term. And our goal is 400. And so it's counting every case that has this funding code that was opened between the start date and the end date of the contract term. And that case will count one against that 400. And so that's how it gets the number. So cases closed during is 200. That's looking at the date closed. Cases open during, that's looking to see if the case was open at any time during. So it could have been opened before the contract term and closed, after the contract term, but it would have been open during the contract term. So anyway, this is where you set up the goals. So that, I think that is a good kind of scenario or kind of a review of what it means to be a contract term. Are there any questions so far with that?
No.
Great. All right. So let's move on to then kind of the mechanics of advanced grants management. So that's getting your, what we talked about so far is getting the grant in and setting up the contract terms for that grant. So let's kind of pivot and talk let's just talk in general about the payroll process. Okay, so the payroll process is comprised of many steps. And so I just want to kind of outline what they are, and then this stuff will start to make sense as to what's happening along the way. So obviously staff is going to be entering their time, and we know from experience that staff does this every day contemporaneous to the work they're doing. So that's never a problem. But staff obviously throughout the pay period is going to put in their time. So within that, we also know that their agencies will do their time, their pay periods based on one of a number of ways. Typically, they're either every 2 weeks, or a lot of times they're once or twice a month. So if they're twice a month, the pay period is going to look at the first date, like say the first day of the month to the 15th, and the 16th to the last day. Although some agencies are not even that. They're like the 4th day to the 20th day or something. But anyway, my time icon up here will show me. So this is a 2-week pay period, and it's showing me when I look at it that I have 5.2 hours in for Monday. I have 0 hours in for today, so it's red. But you notice everything else is gray. It's gray because we are not expected to have time in yet for Wednesday, and we're never expected to have time in for Saturday or Sunday. So this is looking at my work week, and it's looking at the times for the pay period. So this is an important point here, because the work week time, if you get paid twice a month, is functionally different than the pay period time, right? So if we get paid twice a month, the first of the month might be a Wednesday, but we do care for overtime employees what they worked Monday and Tuesday. Even though the pay period time would only count Wednesday through Friday in that week, in that row, we know that the Monday and Tuesday would count towards our work week. So the work week time, the pay period time is important. That's why you see the 2 columns are at the end. It's calculating my time. If you look down below, you can see it says hours for July 9th through to July 22nd. I have 5.2 of my 70 hours in so far. So that's just telling me I have to work 70 hours, and I have 5.2 of those hours in so far. So employees are going to be putting their time in throughout. There is a time and attendance feature that will allow you to create warnings and things if people don't put in a requisite number of hours in a given day. That's just kind of a nuance that we can chat about offline if you're interested in learning more about that, but that feature is in there as well. So the payroll process basically goes like this. I'm an employee. I'm putting my time in throughout the week. I can see all my time here. I can also see my time in my timekeeping tab. It's showing me all the different time for that. At the end of the pay period, I've got my requisite hours in, so I've got my 70 hours in. I will go to confirm my time. And the screen that you'll look at to confirm time will look something like this. Now, this one's already been confirmed, so you don't see the checkbox, but basically it will show the employee by day and by activity type what they've worked, and it will total it along horizontally. So you have on the right hand side, you have a total for that activity type, and then on the bottom you'll have a total for that day. So as we look at this one on Monday the 12th, this person works 7 hours. On Tuesday they work 7.1, and so on and so forth. So at the very end we notice that they have a total of 70.5 hours. They get a link, a checkbox that says, I confirm this is accurate, and they click it, and they have confirmed their time. So the first step of the payroll process is for employees to confirm their time. The second step, and I'm just going to tell you what they are, and then I'm going to show them to you. The second step is for a supervisor to verify that time. So that's, if you look down below, it says that this person confirmed their time on this date on this date at this time. And their supervisor verified their time on this date at this time. So we now have a record of that the time was entered. The employee says it was accurate. The supervisor says that they believe it to be accurate as well. So those are the first two steps.
Excuse me a moment, Ivy.
Yep.
I just want to confirm that this timekeeping feature, or attendance feature, I should say, is this built into Advanced Grants Management, right? It's not in
That's right.
the payroll. Okay, I just wanted to confirm that. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So, and the equivalent of this, what we've heard from other agencies, is this is the employee signing their time slip, and the supervisor signing the same printout of their time. It just replaces the paper and the signature. So that's the second phase. The third phase is something that we call finalization. I'm going to talk a lot about finalization in a second. It's where all the magic happens. I'll leave it there for the time being. The fourth phase is called distribution. That's going to be where you see how the time slips. This is where fiscal sees how all the time is being spent down. And then the final phase is called posting, and that's when it gets locked down. So at every step along the way in the payroll process, less and less people can change the time. So as a normal staff person, once I confirm my time, I cannot change my time. I cannot add time for the pay period. I cannot edit my time in the pay period. So what happens if there's a mistake? Oh, wait a minute. I didn't work 10 hours on that time slip. It was only 1 hour. I totally missed that. I need to go correct that. You can always unfinalize or unconfirm your time, and which takes you out of so you've kind of erased the fact that you've confirmed it. You can go make your edits, save it, and then reconfirm your time, so long as your time has not been verified. So if your time is verified and your supervisor is verified and says, yes, I believe they worked these hours, and oh, you found a mistake, we got to fix it. Great. They can unverify you and then unconfirm you, then you can fix your time and whatever. The reason we do this is so that you're not confirming your time to say I worked 70.5 hours, going in and editing it, and now the total is different and the time is different. And you've said, yeah, I've confirmed it, but you haven't confirmed that you worked the exact amount of time that you're saying you've worked. So you can unconfirm it and then reconfirm it. Same with verification. So the other thing that's at play here, and this is where it gets kind of complicated, so I'll try to explain it in a straightforward way, but pay attention. So there's one other aspect to timekeeping that Advanced Grants Management does that is kind of where it gets its power. And that is that time slips don't just have a duration and a funding code on the time slip. They also end up with what are called sub-rows on the time slips. And the sub-rows on a time slip allow us to take the duration of that time and allocate it to different funding codes on one time slip. So if I worked 8 hours in a day, but I wanted my time, if I worked 8 hours on a time slip and I wanted that time to be allocated on a percentage basis to 4 different grants, to make it easy, because I'm bad at math, I'll just say we're going to do it 25% to all 4 grants, A, B, C, and D. Then 2 hours of my time would go to A, 2 hours would go to B, 2 hours would go to C, 2 hours would go to D. The duration on the time slip is still 8 hours, but the funding on that time is broken up between 4 different funders, 2 hours apiece. So where do we see that? We see that in various places. You get to pick, but typically, like the best example of that is leave time, right? Like we can't charge a funder for all of the time I take for vacation. So what we do is we allocate it based on some type of labor distribution that gets calculated in the background. And I won't go into it because it's too much for the purposes of the demo, but there are different ways that we calculate labor distribution. But I think the concept here that you need to know about is the fact that that labor distribution, whatever the percentages and however it's calculated, is going to get applied during finalization. So what typically happens is in my example of leave time, I put in my leave time slip to some generic fake funding code, vacation time or general time or whatever. Various agencies call it different things. You probably know what it's called in your agency. And what that signals then to the accountants is, okay, we need to distribute that time across the labor distribution, and it's going to get billed out various funders based on percentage basis. We do that in finalization. So when you go, once the employees confirm, supervisors verify, then the fiscal will hit finalization. And when they hit finalization, all of their time will be done. All of their time will be distributed across those labor distributions and spent down on the various grants in relatively real time, meaning that once it's finalized, it'll show you in the distribution screen how that affects each grant. So that's one aspect of finalization that's really important. The second aspect of finalization that's really important, and again, I say this is where all the magic happens, is that if we're going to go back to the baseline that we started the conversation with, which is that we want to be able to audit my time, my paycheck, and the amount I get paid against advanced grants management, then we have to deal with the fact that if I'm supposed to work in this system right now, I'm supposed to work 70 hours every 2 weeks. Some systems it's 80. It just depends on whatever your requisite hours are. But let's just use this system as 70. So this employee has actually worked 70.5 hours. It's less dramatic of an example, but let's say that I worked 90 hours in this pay period. That means that I'm only getting paid for 70 of those hours. I'm not getting paid for the other 20, technically, right? So we don't throw away the time slip that we did on the other 20. What we do during finalization is try to minimize the impact of those 20 hours, and we move all unrestricted time to the bottom of the list. So what we try to do is get to the first 70 hours based on priority. And if we run out of restricted time, then we start using unrestricted time. But hopefully we get to that 70 based on restricted time, and the other 20 get tied to unrestricted. So we're marking things as charged and uncharged. So those sub-rows become important because in order to hit that number 70 exactly, we need to be able to divide time, at least one time slip up and say that one didn't get charged in the sub-row, so that my number is exactly 70. So that's an important piece. Again, it's kind of confusing, but basically the concept is you're only getting paid for the 70. We're going to calculate everything based on that 70. Charge anything above that 70 is going to get marked uncharged. And there's a prioritization that happens in the code to figure out that.
Ivy, I just want to confirm what I think I heard you say. All 90 hours would be charged.
No.
But
well, so again, we have offshoots of this, so you could make it so that all 90 hours are charged. But if you were doing this to the letter, which is how we built it, again, you have to make a decision. Do you want it to be auditable? And if you make it auditable, then you have to charge the first 70, and then the other 20 in my example will be marked uncharged. But we don't want to do that based on just the day of the week. We want to do it based on the type of fund. Like we want certain funding codes to always get charged first. And so we create a prioritization of those funding codes. They're going to get charged first. And then everything else gets down.
But in theory, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I know everybody's sitting here listening to this and thinking the same thing I am about the extra 20 hours. In Pennsylvania, we basically follow the LSC regulation that requires accounting for all time spent. And many of the programs follow the view that advocates are being paid a salary to do a job and not being paid a salary to work X number of hours a week. So it's not unusual that some advocates work more than their scheduled work week. and we charge all the time. So in theory, we would be able to prioritize the 70 hours to spend down the restricted grants, and then we could use advanced grants management to charge the remaining 20 hours to unrestricted or general funds.
That's right. I mean,
All right.
you could. I mean, just to use an example, so you could do it one of a number of ways. But one way to do it, let's say that my rate is $100 an hour. If I worked 90 hours and all 90 hours were for VAWA, right? You have to make a decision to say, are you going to charge VAWA for those 90 hours that I worked at whatever rate you're charging VAWA for my time? Now, look, I think the answer should be yes. The time was worked. VAWA will pay for it. Great. But that probably won't withstand an audit from the standpoint of that your output is going to be different than what you're billing them for. That's not a decision for us.
Right.
It isn't a legal server problem.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys want to go that way, there's a configuration that you get to say, charge all the hours. We don't care about we'll explain it with our auditors why we do it. Great. But we just want to make the point, like, if you go down that road, then you face that challenge. That's all, right? So
Understood.
Yes, you could charge everything, even unrestricted. Everything could potentially get charged. The effect of that is that in my example, the VAWA grant would get spent down by 90 hours times $100 an hour, right? So I think, because I'm, again, horrible at math, but I'm pretty sure that it's $9,000. Right? So the effect on the grant would be a spend down of $9,000. If you do it the first way and you charge the first 70, then the spend down on the grant would be $7,000.
Mm-hmm.
So again, choice is yours, not
okay.
But let me speed up because we're going to run out of time here. The other piece of finalization that's really important is that's where we calculate overtime. In some systems, we can calculate comp time and all. That's kind of where all the magic happens there as well. Because if somebody's making overtime, let me make sure I say this, for non-exempt employees, the ones who get overtime, all of their time is always spent down because you're writing them a check for their overtime and all of that. So they always get spent down, all of their hours. But what we want to do is make sure we're using the right rate. So if they work if their overtime rate is 1.5 after 40, then we calculate any hour after 40 hours at 1.5 their rate. So that's finalization. The step after that is called distribution. And I'm just going to, since we're running, I'm going to try to do this pretty quickly, but I'll try to make it make sense too. I'll try not to go too fast. So basically, there's a lot going on the screen, as you can see. Basically, each of these columns is telling us something different. It's organized that the gray rows are the totals for that grant, and that the people underneath it are the people that work the hours in that grant. So in my 1306 Federation for Foreclosed, you can see it's got a total of 169.81 hours charged. And those hours, if you add up everything below it, we equal 169.81. So this is telling me Penny worked 0.97, Mary worked 63.22, and down the list, right? And then the value of their time is that second column, the current distribution. So for Penny, 0.97 equates to $67.29. That's what we're going to spend down for her work. For Mary, we're going to spend down $1,979.42 and down the list. So that's the calculation then for all of the time spent on that grant by person totaled up to be $6,279.10. So the projected balance is So if I put my mouse over this, I can see that there is an amount remaining in the allocation of $114,000, 114,170.37. So that means that this grant has that much to spend down. So when I take this from that amount, the balance at the end of the pay period is going to be 107,891.27. So the other thing, the target distribution is telling me that if I took from the start date of this pay period to the last day of the contract term and figured out how much money we have over the course of the remainder of the contract to spend, the target distribution is the amount that I would spend if I drew a line equal for every pay period left in this contract term. I should be spending $1,102.03 if I were going to spend this target equally, right? So, but we're not spending $1,100 this pay period. We're spending $6,000 this pay period. So if you look over here, there's a dollar variance of $5,177 over. It just means that we're over target. So we've got, there's no problem with that. We can distribute to that. It's just going to spend down the grant faster than we would if we spent it down on a line. If we were spending under that amount, it would tell us we were under target. And that it's trying to give you a benchmark as to where you are in this pay period as to where you might be if you had a linear regression to the end of the pay and to the end of the contract term. So that's what that number is. The rest of this stuff is telling us where we could take and put time or get time. And that's saying that when you save a time slip, one of the things that Advanced Grants Management does is it records the funding code that you used and any available funding code that you could have used. So this is to say, hey, we're out of money on this grant. We've spent it all, right? Where else can I put this time to get this paid for? Now, maybe that changes, Susan, and when we have the conversation in August about this, but that's what the functionality is. So I could click here to redistribute. Excuse me. That shows me I'm over target on my hours. I have a dollar variance that's over. I can click to get time and move it from other sources to here, or to move it into other sources. So if I wanted to move this time away or move time in, I can distribute from other time slips. I won't go into too much of that because it's, but the idea of distribution is before we distribute, this is where fiscal is kind of fine tuning turning the knobs a little bit to fine tune to make sure that they've got the amount of money that is remaining and all of that you're spending it properly, and you can move it around at this point here as well. The last step of the payroll process is when we post it. This is what gets ultimately sent to your accounting system. This just gives you a breakout with all the accounting codes and things of the time that is being charged in your accounting system. And again, at the end, if you're using it the way it was designed, at the end of the pay period, when you post it, your dollar amount in your spend down account in your accounting system should equal what it is in Legal Server. It should show you what that is in Legal Server. So that's the payroll process. That's kind of Advanced Grants Management in a nutshell. There is one other screen, which this screen here is just showing me all of the pay periods and what the status is. So some pay periods will be marked as posted, and you can see like when people have done everything, like each disposition of the pay period. So, how many people, like over here, you can see this branch has 64 people have confirmed their time. So 64 people for this pay period should confirm their time, but 0 of them have. Once they start confirming their time, this number changes to 11 out of the 64 have confirmed. Then once it's verified, then it will show fully verified once it's finalized. It'll show finalized once it's posted. It'll show posted. So this gives you kind of a audit of the payroll process and see where you are in the payroll process here on the screen. All right, so we're at the hour mark, so I want to just kind of check in real quickly, make sure that we're...
Ivy, I've asked Corey to just talk very briefly about her experience to date using this advanced grants management module. Corey,
Great.
could you say a few words about the experience?
Sure. We've really liked the advanced grants management module. What it's given us, what it gave us is a lot of functionality at the start of the process of Legal Server. Helped us intake. We were able to really, using the funding filters that Ivy showed, really enabled us to fine tune how we accepted cases for each of the grants. We haven't seen a lot of the functionality yet as far as being able to track what the spend downs. We will start to see that on, starting in this fiscal year because of the timing. We were in May, but I see it as a great positive. It makes Legal Server much more functional for a fiscal manager. All these different things, you can go in and fine tune a lot more than you can without it. I guess is the best way I can put it.
Thank you. Does anyone have any quick questions for Ivy? I guess that's a no. Thank you, Ivy. I think you did an excellent job going through this. Speaking for myself, it was very easy to follow, very clear and concise. I hope others found the same, and we do appreciate that you took the time to do this for us.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And if people have questions offline, I'm always accessible by email or phone, and I'm happy to answer questions. So I hope it was useful to everyone. I appreciate your time and listening to it. And thank you, Susan, for setting it up.
You're welcome, and everyone have a good day.
Yep, you do the same.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.